On a clear morning in April 1945, near a small town on the Polish-German border, a U.S. Army officer at a temporary repatriation camp looked up from his desk and saw a tall, blond, exhausted young man in a Soviet Army uniform standing in front of him. The man was carrying a Soviet PPSH-41 submachine gun. He had a German pistol in his belt. He had not shaved in 2 weeks. He was speaking, however, in fluent English with a flat Midwestern accent. He explained that his name was Joseph R. Beyrle of Muskegon, Michigan, that he was a paratrooper in the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, that he had been killed in action on the night of June 6, 1944, according to a War Department telegram his mother had received the previous summer, and that he would now like to go home. The officer asked him to take a seat. Then he picked up the telephone and made a long-distance call to Washington. This is the story of the only known American soldier of the Second World War who fought, in uniform, for both the United States Army and the Red Army of the Soviet Union, escaped from 7 different German prisoner-of-war camps, was officially listed as dead for 10 months by his own government, and came home to bury himself in his own grave. Joseph Robert Beyrle was born on August the 25th, 1923, in Muskegon, Michigan, an old lumber town on the shore of Lake Michigan. His parents were William and Elizabeth Beyrle. His father worked at the Continental Motors plant during the long boom of the 20s and was laid off, with most of his Catholic working-class neighborhood, when the Depression closed the factory gates in 1931. The family went on relief. They lost the small house on Sumner Avenue. They moved into a series of rented rooms. Joe, the third of 7 children, learned to share a single pair of shoes with his older brother for school. He grew up tall, quick, and good at every sport his school could put a team together for. He was a star quarterback at St. Joseph's High School, a state-level shot putter, and a competitive swimmer. He was offered an athletic scholarship to the University of Notre Dame in his senior year. He turned it down. The war was on. His older brother was already in uniform. In June of 1942, 2 weeks after his graduation from St. Joseph's, Joe walked into the Marine Corps recruiting office in Muskegon and was rejected for slightly flat feet. He walked across the street to the Army office and was accepted on the spot. He chose Airborne because he wanted, he later said, to be in the most demanding outfit the Army had. He trained at Camp Toccoa in Georgia, then at Fort Benning where he made his first jumps. He was assigned to Company I, 3rd Battalion, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne Division, the regiment that would later become famous as the Band of Brothers, although Joe was not in easy company. He was a demolition specialist, trained to carry, set, and detonate the small charges that paratroopers used to blow up bridges, railroad tracks, and German communication lines behind the lines. In September of 1943, the 506th was shipped to England. They trained for the next 9 months at Aldbourne in Wiltshire, conducting jumps over the Salisbury Plain by night and learning, in painstaking detail, the routes they would take after they dropped into occupied France. Joe was sent on 2 pre-D-Day intelligence missions into German-held Normandy, both times jumping in alone by parachute with a satchel of gold coins to bribe French resistance contacts, and walking out across the lines after delivering the coins. Both missions succeeded. Both were classified for the next 40 years. He was 20 years old. On the night of June 5, 1944, Joe boarded a C-47 transport at North Witham Airfield in Lincolnshire. The 506's job that night was to drop into Normandy several hours ahead of the seaborne invasion, seize key crossroads and bridges in the area around Corentin, and prevent German reinforcements from reaching the beaches. Joe's specific mission was to blow up a power station near the village of Saint-Côme-du-Mont. The drop went badly. The C-47 carrying Joe's stick of paratroopers was hit by German anti-aircraft fire on the run-in. The pilot lost control momentarily, the green jump light flashed early, and Joe went out the door at perhaps 300 feet over the church steeple of Saint-Côme-du-Mont, far below the minimum safe altitude for a parachute to fully open. His chute opened just in time. He landed hard on the slate roof of the church itself, rolled off, hit the ground in the church graveyard, and lay still for several minutes recovering from the impact. He freed himself from his harness. He gathered his weapons, a Thompson submachine gun, a Colt 1911 pistol, 6 fragmentation grenades, and his demolition satchel. He moved out across the dark Norman countryside in the direction of his target. He was, by this point, separated from every other man in his stick. He walked alone for almost 2 hours through hedgerows and apple orchards. He found the power station. He set his charges. He detonated them. The power station went up. He was confirmed by other 506th men who heard the explosion from their own positions as the man who had taken it out. Then, while withdrawing through a small lane on the outskirts of the village, he ran straight into a German machine gun position he had not known was there. The first burst of MG-42 fire passed over his head. The second burst pinned him in a ditch. He had no clear shot at the gunner. He had no support. He was alone in the dark. After a standoff of perhaps 15 minutes, with German infantry closing in on his ditch from both sides, he made the only decision he could. He stood up with his hands above his head. That was June the 6th. He spent the next 10 months as a prisoner of war. But that's only the start of what he did with that captivity. He was taken first to a temporary collection point near Carentan. The Germans had him for less than a day before he escaped. He slipped over the wall of the holding pen at night, made it half a kilometer into the bocage, and was recaptured by a German patrol at dawn. They beat him with rifle butts and threw him in a barn. 2 days later he escaped again, this time with 3 other Americans, by working loose a board in the wall. They were caught within 12 hours. The Germans, increasingly unimpressed, shipped him east. He was processed through Stalag XIIA at Limburg and Durlan, then onward to Stalag III-C at Altdruitz, deep in eastern Germany, near the Polish border. He arrived there in late July 1944. Stalag III-C was a brutal camp. The food was rotten cabbage soup twice a day and a few hundred grams of black bread. The Russians in the eastern compound were dying of starvation and typhus at the rate of a dozen a week. The Americans were treated slightly better, but only slightly. Joe weighed 175 pounds when he was captured. By Christmas 1944, he weighed 130. In the meantime, the War Department in Washington had received an incorrect report. A German patrol had found a body in Saint-Côme-du-Mont on June the 7th. An American paratrooper whose dog tags had been taken by another soldier, possibly to confuse the Germans, possibly looted. The body was buried hastily and a tag with Joe's name on it was forwarded to American Graves Registration. A telegram went out to his mother in Muskegon on August 17, 1944. Elizabeth Beyrle read it standing in her kitchen. Her son was officially killed in action. There was a funeral mass at St. Mary's Church on Sumner Avenue. Joe's name was carved into the parish memorial. His grave was dug in the Beyrle family plot at the local cemetery. There was a small stone with his name and dates on it. His mother visited it every Sunday for the next 10 months. Joe, 1,800 miles east, did not know any of this had happened. In January of 1945, with the Red Army's massive winter offensive smashing west across Poland toward the German border, Stalag III-C was suddenly within 20 miles of the front. On the night of January the 8th, Joe and 2 other American prisoners, Brewer and Quinn, made another escape attempt. They cut through the wire on the eastern fence, crossed a frozen creek, and walked east through the snow toward what they hoped would be the advancing Russians. They walked for 3 days. Brewer fell behind. Quinn was killed by a German cavalry patrol that ambushed them on the second night. Joe kept walking. On the 4th day, near the Polish town of Reclaw, he saw a column of Russian T-34 tanks moving west along a road through the pine forest. He stood up out of the ditch he was hiding in, put his hands above his head, and shouted at them in the few words of Russian he had learned from the eastern compound at Stalag III-C. Amerikansky Tovarish. The Russian tank commander, a woman as it happened, a senior lieutenant named Alexandra Petrovna Samusenko, one of the very few women commanding T-34s in the war, climbed down from her turret, looked Joe up and down, listened to his explanation, and decided to take him along. What happened next is the part of the story that does not appear in any American history textbook. Joe asked Samusenko if he could fight with her unit. He explained, in his halting Russian and her halting English, that he had no way to get back to American lines, that he wanted to keep fighting, and that he had specialist experience in demolitions. Samusenko thought it over for an hour. Then she gave him a Soviet Army uniform jacket, a fur cap, a PPSH-41 submachine gun, and a place on the back deck of her command tank. For the next 3 weeks, Joe Beyrle fought as an unofficial member of the 2nd Tank Battalion of the 1st Guards Tank Army, attached to Samusenko's vehicle. They fought their way west across Poland, through small villages and pine forests, with the German rearguard collapsing in front of them. Joe blew up bridges. He demolished German communication lines. He spotted concealed anti-tank positions for the Russian tanks. He was wounded slightly, a fragment in the leg from a German potato masher grenade, and treated at a Russian field hospital where Marshal Georgy Zhukov himself, visiting the front to inspect the rate of advance, came through the wards and spotted the strange American among the wounded Soviets. Zhukov questioned Joe through an interpreter for half an hour. He gave him a signed letter on the spot, authorizing him to be transported through Soviet lines to the American embassy in Moscow. Joe carried that letter for the next 6 weeks. He recovered from his wound. He was sent east by train to Warsaw, then to the small town near the old Polish-German border where the American repatriation officer would, in April 1945, look up from his desk and see him standing in his Soviet uniform. From the repatriation camp, he was sent to Moscow. The American embassy received him cautiously. The State Department was suspicious. Soldiers did not, as a rule, fight for foreign armies, and the Cold War was already beginning to chill the diplomatic air between Washington and Moscow. Joe spent 5 weeks in Moscow being debriefed. Zhukov's letter helped. So did the affidavits the Russians provided. Eventually, the State Department concluded that Joe was who he said he was, that his service with the Red Army had been a unique and unrepeatable accident of the Eastern Front collapse, and that he was entitled to be sent home as a recovering American POW. He sailed from Odessa in early May 1945. He landed in Boston on April the 21st, on the 21st of May. He took a train west. He arrived in Muskegon at the end of May 1945, more than 10 months after his mother had received the telegram informing her of his death. He walked from the train station to St. Mary's Parish House. The pastor, Father Beyrle, who had said the funeral mass the previous August, did not at first recognize him. When Father Beyrle did recognize him, he said nothing for a full minute. Then he picked up the telephone and called Elizabeth Beyrle. She was making bread. The flour was still on her hands when she opened the door of the parish house. She looked at her son. She looked at him for a long time. She said, "Joseph." Then she sat down on the steps. That night the whole family went together to the cemetery. Joe stood beside his own grave. He read the small stone with his name on it. He said it felt, he later told his children, exactly the way it sounded, both extremely strange and oddly comforting. He stayed in the Army for a few months, was honorably discharged in November 1945, and went to work for the Brunswick bowling pin factory in Muskegon. He married a young woman named Joanne in 1946. They had 3 children. He worked as a foreman, then a plant supervisor, then a manager. He coached Little League. He never talked much about either war he had fought in. His children grew up knowing only the outline. In 1994, on the 50th anniversary of D-Day, the Russian and American presidents, Bill Clinton and Boris Yeltsin, jointly invited Joe Beyrle to the Rose Garden of the White House. They presented him with a medal from each country: the American Bronze Star, which he had earned at Saint-Côme-du-Mont in 1944, and a Soviet medal for his service with the 1st Guards Tank Army in 1945. The 2 presidents, in the middle of a difficult period of post-Cold War diplomacy, held him up as a small living symbol that the 2 armies had once fought on the same side, against the same enemy, for the same things. Joe's son, John Beyrle, who was at the ceremony as a young State Department officer, would go on to serve as the United States ambassador to the Russian Federation from 2008 to 2012. He represented the country his father had fought for, in the country his father had also fought for, at a moment when the two had never quite stopped being uneasy with each other. Joe Beyrle died in 2004 at the age of 80, while visiting Camp Toccoa in Georgia, the same place he had trained as a young paratrooper 62 years earlier. He had a heart attack in his sleep at the small motel where he was staying for a 506th reunion. He was buried, this time for keeps, at Arlington National Cemetery. There is a small museum at the Brunswick plant in Muskegon. There is a high school scholarship at St. Joseph's in his name. There is a plaque on the church wall at Saint-Côme-du-Mont. There is a stone at the Russian War Memorial at Volgograd that lists him among the foreign volunteers who served under Marshal Zhukov in the Great Drive West. And there is a single small stone still standing in the Beyrle family plot in Muskegon, with his name on it and his date of birth, and no date of death, because there was never any need to carve one. He had already, in a way, come back from his own grave once. If the story moved you, there are other men, quiet, brave, forgotten, waiting in the same long line of history. Subscribe to follow the Untold front. New stories every week.